Good evening, colleagues from UWC, from Ghent University, and our international colleagues, and good afternoon to our colleagues from Missouri. It's lovely to be able to welcome you to the second Tri-Continental webinar series between our strategic partners, Ghent University, University of Missouri, and also we know that there are participants from the other universities, both in Europe and in the USA and Africa, who are joining us today. The webinar series, the first webinar series we had was on race and racism last year, which focused on the difficulties around racism and these manifestations. And the second series here is on domestic extremism and the threats to democracy. And the idea was germinated through conversation with Rod Uphoff, who, as all of us, were also looking at the very difficult circumstances that took place just in the US with its election and the violent insurrection and goading of violence by the then president, Donald Trump, and how its impact now worldwide. And this with our partners, our three directors, Rod Uphoff from University of Missouri, Mary Stegmaier from University of Missouri, and Annelies Verdulager, our director from Ghent University, germinated the idea of having this series that would then look at domestic extremism in our three different contexts. Today we have our three presenters from UWC, Prof. Usang Assim from the Dullah Omar Institute at the university, Prof. Keith Gottschalk, who is a stalwart of UWC in the political science department, and Prof. Namhla Matshanda, who is also from the university's political science department. And our focus today will be looking at domestic extremism and some of its manifestations and transformations on the continent of Africa. And we have reflections from Nigeria that Prof. Usang will share with the Boko Haram and the kidnapping of girls. Prof. Namhla Matshanda will be speaking about her experience in Ethiopia, her research in that area and the Horn of Africa and how it impacts regionally. And Prof. Keith Gottschalk will then share information on domestic extremism and some of how that has manifested in South Africa. So I'd like to invite our presenters to share the information with us. And before that, I'd just like to say that there will be, for anyone who needs to send any questions or during this webinar, please just use the Q&A function, the icon where the questions can be asked. They'll be posed to the presenters, and then we can have them contribute. The structure will be that we will start with Prof. Usang Assim, work, then Prof. Keith Gottschalk, and then Prof. Namhla Matshanda, followed by a question and answer session for 15 to 20 minutes before we round off and do the introductions to our international directors in our partnership, as well as give you information about our next session in April that is hosted by Ghent University. I want to just, again, thank you, welcome, and Prof. Usang, hand over to you. You have 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. All right, so I titled my presentation, Domestic Extremism and the Weakening of Governance, Confronting the Enemy Within. Because in my view, what we're talking about is something that has to be looked at internally in order to find solutions. Too often, it's always like those who are responsible or affected are looking outside for ways to find the solutions when the solutions actually begin from within. So that's why I titled my presentation this way. Speaking from a Nigerian context, I'd just like to give a little bit of a background to say that when we talk about extremist groups, especially the violent ones, they have different manifestations, and they've been existing even from pre-colonial times. So the way I split just the four I want to mention in this presentation, I'll be focusing on Boko Haram particularly, but I just want to mention the four strands of different groups. Boko Haram actually is divided into two. So there was the Boko Haram that many of us know that was functional up until 2015. And then in 2015, there was a split in the Boko Haram into two groups. So the second group is affiliated with ISIL. So it's known as the Islamic State, the West Africa province. So there are two strands of Boko Haram. And this second one is much more organized and has been responsible for more of the recent things we've been hearing about. Then there's also extremists in the form of herdsmen who gather as ethnic militias. And as a result of their, should I say, occupation of trying to cut their cattle from place to place, encroach on the rights and the properties, such as farmlands of other people, in a bid to secure food for their cattle. And those ones too have been responsible for the slaughtering of many people. Then we also have those that some of you would know as the Niger Delta region, militant groups from that part of the country. A prominent example is known as the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta MEND. So they also are another extremist group that targets oil installations and security forces, and also engage in kidnapping, particularly of foreign personnel, as a way of securing ransom from their different state governments or the government as a whole. Now we're trying to focus on Boko Haram as an extremist group and some of the activities. I decided to just give some particular timelines just to give us a guide, at least for those who might not have details. Prior to 2009, I put establishment in inverted commas because Boko Haram has always been in existence, but in different forms. Now, even in pre-colonial times, we had, up until the 1980s, we had what was known as the Maita-Sane group. They were responsible for a lot of brutal killings in that time in the country. And it was also a similar motivation. They started on the basis of the fact that the political elite were not taking into account the needs of the ordinary population. And the leader, that time known as Mawa Muhammad, rose up and began to gather the poor and destitute in the city of Kano. And these people followed him. And he was of the view that Islam had to be, he was trying to purify the religion and saying that modernization and the influence of colonialism were corrupting the Islamic influences in the country or in that part of the country. This was, interestingly, this was from pre-colonial times, and the British colonial authorities condemned him as well as other Islamic clerics at the time. Post-independence, this continued, and then we had brutal attacks in the 1980s that was quelled by government forces. Now, fast forward to 2000s, we had the rise again of another man known as Mohammed Yusuf, who became known as the founder of Boko Haram. This started around the 2000s itself, and a similar scenario. This was a person who believed that Western education and influences from the West are corrupting the practice of Islam, and decided that the way forward was to try to establish a purist Islamic state by turning against everything that had to do with modernization and the influence of Westernization. Ironically, his followers were expected to follow the ideals he was propagating, but he himself was not doing that. So in fact, there are those who have written to say that his motivations was to belong to the political class only just to be able to gain, from the share of the national cake, as people would like to put it. So in the 2000s, it was always there, but it was in 2009 that it became so much more, known to a very larger scale because of the brutal attacks that they were engaging in at that time. And the military got a hold of him together with a few other people and handed him over to the police. But then he was killed, and there was a public display of that. This led to uprisings in 2010, and then there was an emergence. In 2011, there was the first case of suicide bombing that was targeting the Inspector General of Police. And then fast forward to 2014, the famous or infamous abduction of the 276 Chibok girls that gained international attention. Now, like I mentioned before, in 2015, we experienced a split of Boko Haram into two factions, with the first one being under Abubakar Shekau and the second one being affiliated with ISIL, known as Islamic State West Africa Province, under Abubakar Benawi. Now, the main difference between the two is that the second group condemns the approach of Shekau in targeting Muslim targets and the use of things like suicide bombing or child soldiers and all of those things. But it doesn't mean that they are nice. They're just different and had a difference in terms of methodology of going about their approaches. And also, the second Boko Haram is actually much more organized, and they have more permanent troops and are well-resourced compared to the first one. Well, the first one had lots of focused on sporadic attacks, while the second one has been much more organized because of the affiliation it has with other countries. And it has expanded its atrocities into neighboring countries, not just Mali, Chad, and Cameroon, as people know, but even places like Burkina Faso have been impacted by this group. In 2019, again, second largest number of deaths were recorded. In 2020, another set of abductions, this time schoolboys. And in 2021, the country was ranked the number 3 on the list of the most terrorized countries in the world. Even in this, as recent as 2021, we've had more abductions. To date, almost 40,000 people have been killed, and this is speaking just about Nigeria alone. About 2.5 million displaced in the Lake Chad basin of all those 4 countries, and over 200,000 refugees have been created. Now, going back again to some of the contextual background I was given, Mohammed Yusuf was the leader at that time, who himself, not getting access to schooling, that became the motivation for preaching or criticizing Western education, and seeing Western education as a means by which a small elite were continuing to feed fat while the majority of the populace remained in poverty. So the ideology is the rejection of Western education, the overthrow of secular government, because it was viewed as a purveyor of malgovernance, governance, corruption, and poverty. And finally, more importantly, the goal of imposing an Islamic state governed on the basis of the Sharia law. Like I initially mentioned, he was captured by the military in 2009, handed over to the police, who subsequently killed him extrajudicially. And this was publicly done along with the 72-year-old father-in-law. So followers went on a revenge mission, and that became the descent into what we have today. Second, Boko Haram group, like I said, is greater in threats due to the broader geographical spread and organizations. Now, what are some of the impacts, especially when we talk about democracy? The first thing that I wanted to just point out is the fact that Boko Haram and these activities of extremism actually threaten the very basis of democracy as it obtains. Prior to 1999, Nigeria was under successive military governance. So there was a lot of repression and suppression, nothing to do with democracy. So it was a very much celebrated thing when the country returned to the constitutional democracy in 1999. And everybody thought this was a new beginning of better times. So democracy itself was seen as a system of government to usher in change for the benefit of everyone. But Boko Haram, right after that, from the 2000s, began this again, because the new political class again was seen by this small sect as a group of people who were only there for themselves and feeding fat at the expense of the rest of the country. And with religion as a basis, and having a massive population of people who are in poverty, who have no connection to the state, it was easy to target all of this. And obviously, so many rights are affected. Obviously, the right to life, so many people have been killed, political rights, and even socioeconomic rights. When you target education and children cannot go to school, that's one of the fundamental socioeconomic rights. And markets are targeted, places of business, churches, mosques, and all the likes. These are all pointing to the fact that government is weak in terms of the structures and systems. Very importantly, I wanted to highlight the fact that elections have been a main target. Several local elections have repeatedly been delayed as a result of Boko Haram attacks. And this is not a coincidence, because if the goal is to overthrow democracy and the government as it operates, elections, which is supposed to be a vehicle for the kind of government or system of government that is practiced, is going to be under attack. So continuously, especially in the Northeast and now increasingly in the Northwest, where the main attacks have been located, elections, local elections in particular, have repeatedly been delayed. Now, very important to note that Boko Haram is able to draw strength from all the factors that combine to date to cripple the Nigerian state. Of course, this includes astonishing levels of corruption at all levels, constant misuse of the country's corrupt oil and the country's oil wealth, and very significantly, an ever-widening gap between an elite group and the impoverished majority. All extremist groups are able to justify their atrocities on the basis of what their actions are being attempts to win a fairer share of the country's national or natural wealth. And that is the same tale that Boko Haram has been selling. Now, the next impact in terms of how many of all these long ignored socioeconomic imbalances in the country have been left to fester in the face of massive corruption and gross human rights violations. These continue to provide fertile ground for such extremist groups and for their activities to blossom unabated. Now, it tells you about unmet democratic expectations. I put democracy there in inverted commas because there was a tendency, like I said before, that democracy, being a system of government that is participatory, was supposed to be a system that brings together both the governed and the government into participating in a common goal and system of government that provides to meet the needs, socioeconomic needs especially, of all of the population. But after years of seeing the leadership continuing to feed fat on the wealth of the country while the masses remain impoverished, the feelings have always been that this democracy is not meeting our expectations. So what is the point? Now, you also have the fact that there's been a lot of focus on military responses, but without tackling the socioeconomic components of the crisis. So you continue to have a never-ending siege with the ordinary civilian population being the ones to bear the brunt. So there is a disconnect between the government's approach and the expectations of the people. And because there's no middle ground, problem remains protracted. Now to talk about some of the interventions and the challenges. Like I mentioned, the approach has been highly militarized. And so we have a situation where the attempts of the government to quell these extremist groups and their activities have themselves been very abusive and in violation of human rights. So you would have infrastructure destroyed, homes destroyed, when government security forces have suspicions that certain villages, homes, or families are connected to Boko Haram, or even have been attacked by or visited by Boko Haram suspected group members. So you have a highly militarized approach which fails to address the root causes of the problems. Now, this is coupled with a lack of seriousness. At the beginning, there was this tendency that this has to be a joke, it can't be serious. The government did not take it seriously, and it was felt that you just publicly shame one or two people and it will be over. So there was a delay in tackling this issue, as well as weak capability on the part of the security forces. So even though there's massive provision of funds to the defense, you don't find sufficient weapons. And there's also a lack of competence and experience in dealing with these issues, despite the fact that they have existed in the history of the country. So this gap continues to make room for Boko Haram to grow, gain strength, and gain following, especially now where they begin to link up with other groups in East Africa, in North Africa, and in other parts of the world, your Al-Qaedas and your ISILs and the rest. So this makes them to grow and gain strength. Now, the countries in the Lake Chad Basin region, your Cameroon, Niger, and Chad, joined forces with Nigeria to form the multinational joint task force. However, there has been some frustrations, because sometimes Chad, for example, has sent troops twice to assist in pushing back these insurgents and these extremists. However, there has not been seen to be enough done on the part of the government of Nigeria to keep those grounds gained. And we are not seeing any efforts to keep people accountable for the actions that have been taken. So there's been this tension between the carrot and the stick approach for how to deal with these terrorists, and there's no point of agreement. Strategies have also been inconsistent. At the time, the military used to deploy different groups and in small troops to different hotspots to quell the influence of these extremist groups. However, they changed their strategy at some point to form super camps, what is known as super camps in particular strongholds. The problem with this is that the same troops who were in the communities were the ones sent to be in these super camps, thereby leaving those hinterland areas and communities vulnerable and unprotected to further or continuing attacks. So a lot of the strategies employed have been inconsistent. And so the actions and the results you see are also not progressively increasing to tackle the problem. In some cases, they are actually making things worse or retrogressing the situation. Of course, there have been interventions at the foreign level also. There have been designation of the group as a foreign terrorist organizations, even though at the beginning, there have been criticisms that there was a delay in doing this, and this gave them time to gain grounds and to gain following and support. Eventually, they were designated so, and there's been supply of troops, but not enough has been done to complement national effort. And the blame in this is not on the foreign assistance, it's on the national government, because the primary responsibility for security still lies with the national government. So if there is no focus of the national leadership to be genuinely committed to change and to addressing this situation, then it's going to be a never-ending chain that we don't get a solution to. One of the examples I like to use is when sometimes we talk about the capacity. While the capacity is indeed a problem, when you think about the kind of force that was used to quell the EndSARS movement and compare it to the fact that Boko Haram, over 10 years now, the same kind of force has not been employed, it does tell you where there are some gaps somewhere. So I'm coming to the end, and I just wanted to just give a few of the things that I have been putting together as possible ways to address these issues. The Boko Haram crisis is one of those problems that you can call a wicked problem, because getting a solution is it's really difficult. It needs various stakeholders to come together and try to find a solution. And that is one thing which I think is missing, because the fact that the government continues to think they can just use highly militarized approaches is to ignore the possibility to get input from other sectors of society or other stakeholders who can give us good ideas on how to tackle this problem. So the first thing is to acknowledge that there is indeed a problem and there is an enemy within, and call it what it is. In the last 10 years, the government has been very quick, always very quick to claim victory, saying that we have defeated Boko Haram, we have pushed them away. But the evidence on the ground suggests that that is not so. So rather than being interested in patting ourselves on the back, let us call it what it is and say, this is a problem here. And then obviously, we know about endemic corruption in the security forces and in the fabric of the governance as a whole. This needs to be addressed, and prioritization is one of the key ways to go about it. Obviously, there is the ideological dimension of Boko Haram. I cannot go in, there's no time to go into all of those details, but you need to look at the socioeconomic dimensions also. I put a good example there. There are over 90 million people who live in poverty. 80% of that number are in the north of the country. There are about 11 million children out of school. The majority of these are in that same part of the country. Obviously, extremists will capitalize on these socioeconomic vulnerabilities as soft targets for sympathy and to secure recruits. So these are some of the things that need to be done, bridge the gaps to bring changes that we need. Because I would like to end by two things, two quick quotes here. First, Matthew Morgan had said that the terrorists or extremists don't actually want a seat at the table. They want to destroy the table and everyone sitting at it. And that's what I mean by confronting the enemy within. If that is a fact, then we need to know that resolving the conflict can occur only if we satisfactorily ameliorate all of these underlying issues and address underdevelopment in the most affected areas. And in that way, we have a mixed methods approach to deal with the problem, and we can begin to talk about a way out of the quagmire. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Usang Assim. I think if you can just mute. Thank you very much for that very insightful input. It raises the critical issues which I think you flagged in your recommendations about corruption, poverty, climate change, and socioeconomic inequity, which requires a multimodal and a multifaceted intervention. Appreciate that very much. And I think it's certainly in keeping for our continent, something that is of great importance for us to have and share. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Professor Keith Gottschalk from our Political Science Department, who will have 20 minutes to talk a little bit about his thoughts on domestic extremism and threats to democracy from a perspective, from a South African perspective. Keith, over to you.
Thanks. My paper will have a broad perspective informed by political sociology. If we can just move to the next slide, please. Thanks. Move one line further. When we became a democracy in 1994, fears of a threat to democracy naturally lay with the previous rulers. They were then on the far right, racist armed militias such as the Afrikaans Weerstandbeweging, and a general in the defense force demonstrated his ability to organize something called the Volksfront, where 30,000 armed Afrikaners with rifles and pickup trucks were mobilized and deployed around the country. And it took skillful negotiations from Mandela to persuade the Volksfront to divert itself into electoral parliamentary politics, where they founded a right-wing party called the Vryheid Front. And so that danger of a military rebellion from the far right was defused. Since 1990, over 800,000 white South Africans have immigrated, mostly to Australia, and this also, of course, helped diffuse the potential for a right-wing armed threat. The next line, please, on the slide. Next, as a political scientist, we just turn our glance to the opposite extreme of the political spectrum. The most left-wing organizations I can find are the New Unity Movement and the International Socialist Movement in South Africa. However, both of these have always been opposed to military action. Their focus is on political education, that is on political propaganda among intellectuals and among the working class. Then, if we can have the next line on the slide, please. In 1995, an organization was founded called People Against Gangsterism and Drugs. A year later, a militarist faction hijacked this organization. They assassinated 3 out of the 4 founders. And from starting off by shooting drug dealers, they rapidly expanded their range of targets to include imams of liberal mosques, to include bombing restaurants such as the Planet Hollywood, to include prosecutors and prosecution witnesses, and raided the Claremont police station for arms. And they were finally all arrested and jailed in 2000, that year. Now, fortunately for democracy, this was a very small militaristic minority among the Muslim minority, which in turn is among the mixed race or colored minority here. I've chosen not to use the concept of Islamic fundamentalism because those jailed from Pagad none of them, for example, forbid their families to have TV in the home. They wore Western dress, not Arabic clothes. They did not pray more frequently than the average South African Muslim. So I don't think this heuristic value in calling them Islamic fundamentalists, even though they use Islamic slogans and some Islamic iconography. Fortunately, that threat has since then been suppressed, and while Pagad still exists today, it follows only lawful actions as it did in the first year of its existence. Now, the fourth potential threat to democracy will be the one that naturally was top of every South African's minds when we became a democracy after 300 years of an authoritarian colonialist state becoming a settler colonialist state and culminating in the apartheid police state with censorship, the banning of media, banning of organizations, banning of activists, disfranchisement of Black voters, detention without trial, and other violations of the rule of law, such as statutes under which accused were guilty until proven innocent, like the pass laws, the Sabotage Act, and the Terrorism Act over there. So when we got our constitution in 1996, it about the longest bill of human rights in the world. It marked a very dramatic break from past history of state authoritarianism in this way. I've been able to trace as a historian that before 1996, we had at least 16 written constitutions, plus of course the unwritten constitutions of indigenous kingdoms and chiefdoms. However, these were constitutions, not constitutionalism, in that all previous constitutions were simply a law which could be amended like any other law. The concept that you have a constitution where even the government has to obey the law and the courts may rule a law itself to be illegal if it violates the Bill of Rights, that began with our permanent constitution in 1996. And in addition to having the whole Section 2 of the Constitution being a Bill of Rights, it established a complete rupture from the past, a counter-majoritarian judiciary with power to even overrule an elected government. It set up an independent police investigative directorate because of the history of police atrocities and killings in our past. It borrowed from the Scandinavian Ombudsman, a Office of the Public Protector, and there were various other institutions set up to strengthen democracy. In retrospect, we know that too many appointments were left in the power of the current president of the day in this constitution. Now, under this heading, we all obviously turn an eye to look at institutions that have an authoritarian institutional background, such as naturally the armed services. However, in South Africa, these are depoliticized, they're small, and there's no danger of a coup from them. And of course, also the authoritarian culture in the police force. This goes back to when the apartheid Prime Minister Balthazar Vorster in 1962 militarized the police in terms of ranks, armament, and functioning. And 2 years after it became a democracy, the government's major reform was in 1996 to demilitarize the police, to bring back civilian ranks, a less authoritarian culture, and a more community-focused policing. Unfortunately, in 2009, the government remilitarized the police, and this led to further massacres, such as the 2 massacres Americana, by police using rifles for crowd control. The National Planning Commission and the Farnham Commission have subsequently strongly recommended that the government should, for the second time, demilitarize the South African police, and ensure it is a police service, not a police force. But unhappily, the government has not yet implemented those recommendations, so we need to keep up pressure on this. The other examples of state authoritarianism that has been phone tapping of investigative journalists, and in all these instances, it's been a civil society pushback against the dominant party that has kept the threats at bay. The fifth potential threat to democracy, if we go back half a century, the British sociologist Stanislav Andreevsky revived the concept of kleptocracy, rule by thieves. And here, the first actions of corrupt politicians and corrupt bureaucrats was to push back against the police units that focused on corruption. So the Scorpions police unit was abolished, the Hawks police unit was purged, the National Prosecution Authority and the South African Revenue Service were all purged of their most effective managers. We then had, under President Zuma, grand-scale corruption, locally termed state capture, and this has been exposed in numerous media, in books with titles such as How to Steal a Country, How to Steal a City. This is similar to the US spoil system, but it is patronage and clientelism on a larger scale. Now, the political impact of kleptocracy is that it, of course, discredits democracy. It can lead to cynicism towards the parliamentary system and cause an electoral decline, and then fewer and fewer people can see any point in continuing to vote at elections if all you get after election is another corrupt clique over there. And of course, the corruption in stealing parts of the budget means there is less funds available for carrying out election promises of the ruling party, such as housing, such as health, and other aspects of social welfare. The sixth potential threat to democracy is that we have a protracted unemployment rate of 42% unemployment. This, of course, if you think of Franklin Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, freedom from hunger is not achieved. But beyond the obvious points of malnutrition, 27% of children in South Africa show signs of stunting. I want in this paper to focus on the political impact of such protracted unemployment. There's a disillusionment that democracy is not a system that can deliver. And notice that this figure I've mentioned of 42% unemployment is an average. Among working class under 25 years old, unemployment is at 62%. In one town, in a small town in the countryside called Rivier, unemployment is actually 93%. So protracted unemployment, it means that many political activists show sarcasm towards the Mandela and Archbishop Tutu concept of a rainbow nation. It means all sorts of political pathologies arise. You have populist demagogues indulging in race baiting from both sides of the color bar line. You have the rise of xenophobia, and indeed we've had xenophobic pogroms against the diaspora of 2 million Africans from other countries in Africa living over here. These are in essence unemployed Black mobs attacking poor Black foreigners over there. We have the pathologies of a violent crime wave, of alcoholism and drug addiction as some of the consequences of such protracted unemployment. And this must always be flagged as a serious concern for the survival of democracy. Seventh, I'd like us to look at non-state authoritarianisms as my last category of threats to democracy in South Africa. Drug gangs are armed and on a huge scale throughout the ghettos of our towns and cities. Once the drug dealers realize that the courts would impose far smaller sentences for murder on teenagers and youngsters than they would on adults, they then move to rapidly recruit school dropouts as child soldiers, as hitmen, so that you have 15, 14-year-olds carrying out the murders in the streets. Now here, the police and our detectives have only a shocking 3% rate of convictions for gang murders. So this gives the gangs the aura of invincibility, and that what they say goes, and they can enforce it in too many streets of our towns. A second category of non-state armed groups are several variants of protection racketeering. One of these is what is in South Africa known as taxi wars, which means minibus routes have protection rackets whereby drivers of minibuses must pay thousands of rand in protection money to someone or other. It's led to the murder of many Uber drivers, for example, in many areas here. Then on building sites, a new phenomenon in the last 2 or 3 years has been gangs demanding a 1/3 kickback from whichever construction company gets the contract on a building site. And again, it requires construction companies to hire armed guards and to freeze building activity until the police arrive to protect them. We must also notice in passing that while South Africa has 200,000 police officers, the propertied and moneyed classes have 1 million armed guards in private armed response companies. These sometimes go beyond the limits of the law by putting a boom, that is gates, to block traffic in public roads, by stopping all pedestrians and demanding they state who they're going to visit. There are, of course, lawfully established gated communities or security communities, but in some cases, these private security companies have gone beyond that. The working class version of this is that, of course, unemployed people cannot afford to hire an armed response company. They set up neighborhood watches which engage in patrols. But unfortunately, these patrols all too often go beyond making citizens arrests and handing suspects over to the police. They involve themselves in lynching of alleged rapists and alleged burglars and burning the corpses. So this is again not compatible with the rule of law in a democracy and must be flagged as a potential threat to a functioning democracy. I'd now like to briefly make some conclusions. If we can please have the next slide. The first thought is that the resilience of South Africa's democracy against threats we have discovered from our quarter of a century of democracy depends on both, the next line please, the robustness of institutions in defending themselves against gerrymandering or undermining of various sorts, and also to a vibrant civil society which can exert strong pushback against threats to democracy. Thank you for your attention and look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Keith, for a thoughtful but also a very sobering and worrying depiction of the nature of the difficulties that we face. And given, you know, our images, our rainbow image, and the beauty of Table Mountain and the joy of our people, it's really something that you have with such clarity and astuteness brought us to think about. So we really look forward to some of the Q&A in the presentation a little later. Thank you very much, Keith. I really appreciate that. Can I invite Prof. Namhla Matshanda to speak to us, to the next presenter. Prof. Namhla, welcome, and the floor is yours for 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the chair, the hosts, and organizers of this event. I'm happy to be here this evening. In 2020, last year, I published an article that explores the potential role of Ethiopia in resolving the uncertainty that has characterized the Horn of Africa over the past few decades. The article came against the backdrop of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's rise to power in 2018 and the wide-ranging reforms that he introduced. In the article, I chose the word potential quite deliberately because I and many others knew that the new Prime Minister's powers are circumscribed both by history and the nature of the Ethiopian state, particularly when it comes to confronting the national question. Previously, they have dealt with this question by mostly ignoring it or by pretending that it doesn't exist. Previous leaders have dealt with this question by wishing it away. So many of us were very much aware that the developments that we saw in 2018 ought to be approached with cautious optimism. In my talk, I'm going to try and provide some historical context to the ongoing conflict in the Tigray region and to offer some insights on what it all means for the democratic project in Ethiopia, but also perhaps to consider what it all means for the ongoing project of state and nation building in that country. So a bit of background to the conflict in Tigray. On the 4th of November last year, in 2020, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, in just over 2 years since he came to power, and roughly a year after he received the Nobel Peace Prize, ordered an offensive on the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, the ruling party of the northern Tigray region, for allegedly attacking a military installation or a military base and for stealing weapons. For many keen observers of Ethiopia, myself included, this conflict did not entirely come as a surprise. History shows us that the modern Ethiopian state is constructed in a way that highlights inherent power struggles between the center and its peripheries. The next slide, please. Now, naturally, the conflict has grave implications for democracy, not just in Ethiopia, but in the wider region, in the wider Horn of Africa region. Some have argued that the conflict is a temporary setback and has no bearing on the long-term process of democratization in Ethiopia. I don't agree with this. I think what we are currently witnessing is a major of the potential that we saw in the reforms in 2018. in the past week alone, we have seen more evidence that seems to support allegations of war crimes in the conflict. And during also seen a coordinated effort of the government, including the silencing of journalists. Next slide, please. What can history tell us about the conflict? Since the late century, lead the state to hire the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi have all been preoccupied with the singular aim of avoiding and the cautious optimism.
Prof. Namhla, sorry to interrupt your presentation. We seem to be sorry, Prof. Namhla. Yes. Your connectivity is coming in and going out. May I ask if it's okay for you to switch off your video, and we'll see whether the sound improves, because you're breaking up as you're speaking, and we're really keen on hearing your important information. Thank you very much. Let's try this. Graham, will you just let us know if see if it's working okay now? Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Next slide, please. Okay. All right. Most people saw 2018 and the reforms that were introduced in 2018 as a potentially big moment, not just in Ethiopia, but for the entire region as well. And this is because what happens in Ethiopia inevitably becomes relevant and important beyond Ethiopia's borders. Who governs or rules Ethiopia is often of great significance to neighboring states, who sometimes have a vested interest in Ethiopian statehood. And here I'm thinking specifically about Eritrea and Somalia. The countries in the Horn of Africa have a historical tendency to interfere in each other's conflicts in order to achieve some political goal at home. This interference is often facilitated through their mutual borders and respective borderland regions that straddle ethnically related or similar groups of people. What this means in practice is that there is constant dialogue among the countries of the region, as what happens in one country is immediately felt in neighboring countries. I think we can already see this pattern starting to emerge in the ongoing conflict. The role of Eritrea in particular is a source of great concern to many, with the reports that we are hearing on the role of the Eritrean army in the conflict. The recent flaring of border tensions with Sudan are also a worrying factor. And in relation to Sudan, these tensions will be further exacerbated by the issue of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam that concerns Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. I think we can safely conclude that an unstable Ethiopia will result in an unstable Horn of Africa. Okay, that slide, yes. Back to the domestic situation. Over the past 5 years, we have seen conflict intensify in several regions of Ethiopia, such as the Oromo region, the Amhara region, and the southern nations. This in addition to the perpetual instability of the Somali region. The conflict in Tigray adds to this long list of simmering tensions and domestic conflicts, resulting in a level of domestic instability not seen for decades in Ethiopia. These conflicts, I believe, are a direct consequence of the unfulfilled promises that were made by the TPLF-led government in the early 1990s to democratize the state. This neglect has unfortunately been enabled by the international community, which turned a blind eye to the numerous warning signs that pointed to the complete cessation of the democratic project. Political development was effectively sacrificed for economic development and growth. On the conflict in Tigray specifically, I want to propose that this conflict and the other simmering domestic conflicts should be viewed as a symptom of two historical and enduring problems that characterize the Ethiopian state. And for as long as Ethiopian leaders continue to appear unable or unwilling to confront these in an honest and transparent manner, the problems will persist. And these relate to questions of power and the nation. On power, the modern Ethiopian state was founded on state centralization under imperial rule. This was the case up to 1991, after which a period of some kind of decentralization was introduced. The formation of the modern state in the late 19th century, the empire state, was shaped by the absorption of territories that were located to the southeast and west of the political center. The incorporation of these territories influenced the emerging idea of the Ethiopian state. Subsequently, the peripheries shaped the evolution of state bureaucracy and the definition of the national territory. However, the introduction of federalism and the establishment of the semi-autonomous federal regions after 1991 failed to fundamentally transform the historical center-periphery power dynamics that underlined this highly centralized pre-1991 state. And on the national question, this has evolved within the power dynamics that I've just described, where the nation was conceptualized according to the Amhara identity. The crisis of nationality is therefore rooted in the history of the Amhara-dominated state that emerged in the late 19th century. Now, in the 1990s, the TPLF introduced ethnic nationalism by means of ethnic federalism in an attempt to radically change this historical construction of the Ethiopian nation. However, this project did not yield the expected results. And I believe that one of the main reasons for this failure or for the limitations of this project has to do with the fact that ethnic nationalism was not introduced and implemented within a democratizing state. The national political context was not conducive to such a to such a radical redefinition of the nation. There was also, in addition to this, of this absence of a democratic space, there was also active ideological resistance to ethnic nationalism. And the current conflict in Tigray and elsewhere in the country in many ways demonstrates the extent of this resistance. And in closing, I want to turn to the 2011 publication, The Last Two Frontiers, by renowned scholar of Ethiopian studies, John Makakis, who warns that, I quote, "The project of state building is far from completion and its end cannot be predicted." He goes on to say that the analysis, quote, "The analysis of succeeding crises along the route highlights the structural faults in its design, which is the center's monopoly of power." Makakis warns that another political rupture is imminent in Ethiopia if the center does not successfully bring the lowland peripheries within its fold. He was, of course, to a large extent correct. He was correct, but today I think we are witnessing something that not many would have predicted, a situation where the center seems to have turned on itself. Thank you. I think I'll end there for now.
Thank you very much, Prof. Namhla Matshanda, for a very thoughtful presentation. What it does raise for us in our conversation moving forward, and I'd like to invite all the panelists to come in here and Graham, if you can make that happen. In our Q&A, there are several important questions that are being raised, and also some very strong feelings being expressed, which I will share here. But I think the point I wanted to ask was perhaps Prof. Usang, to start the conversation a little bit about the point that was made here by Bonafice Omata, and her question was, could you briefly explain the ideology behind Boko Haram, and what role does Sharia promotion in northern Nigeria play, and are the sponsors of sympathizers of Boko Haram in government? I imagine you have strong answers for that, and I want to then take the lead on to what are some of the other areas that are synergies and a thread of extremism in social conditions that facilitate these areas of domestic extremism, violence, and genocide. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Boniface, for those questions. Okay, so the first question, you asked me to briefly explain the ideology behind Boko Haram. So put very simply, or simplistically even, there are three things. So the first is a rejection of Western education, right? The second is the overthrow of the secular government as it exists. And final is to impose an Islamic state on the basis of Sharia law. But what is interesting is you need to go behind why this ideology, where did it come from, or what fueled it and what is fueling it. And I just want to dive a bit again to the history like I did at the beginning, because it's a missing element or dimension of some of the conversations we are having around this thing today. In pre-colonial times, when the indirect rule system was being used, there was an attempt to privilege the children of key traditional rulers or other people to provide them with education, right? From the colonial systems. So other people couldn't access it in the same way. Now, this continued post-independence, but unfortunately, it remained that way in the North. But in parts of the South, with promotion of things like free education and all of those things, it was more widespread. So already at that time, you had a seed had already been sown to say that those who have access to this become a certain class of people who are better than the rest. So it gave these extremists something to hold on to say, these people who follow this kind of education are put here to oppress us, and they are the ones who have access to state coffers and good positions in government, while the rest of us suffer. So let's go back to what we think obtained before they came, which was our religion. So you would have some say things like, we had Islam before the colonial masters came and corrupted the environment. So let's go back to it. So that's a missing link in some of the conversations. So, and that's the same playbook that Boko Haram now started to use again in the 2000s, because the fundamental situation had not changed. You still had an elite which was focused on itself while not being committed to improving the socioeconomic life of the general populace. So that's just putting it in a nutshell for that first question. Now, the second one is about sponsors and sympathizers. There are lots of people who have said, yes, evidence has shown. Of course, the people who have been pinpointed have all denied it. You even have the governor of states like Kanu, Borno, Kanu, and all of those things who have been at different times who have been accused of being sponsors, and they have denied it. But the truth is, the kind of activities, atrocities that they have been engaging in and that have been so widespread cannot happen without some sort of, even if not active support, acquiescence somewhat, because sometimes inaction itself is consent. When you don't take action, you are saying, I approve of what you're doing. So you begin to find a situation where some people in government, either directly or indirectly, sponsor this or allow the environment that makes it conducive to do that. Now, in terms of sponsors, that's one aspect. In terms of sympathizers also, that's where the mixture comes between ethnic nationalism or sentiments being mixed with the whole situation. And that's why I keep on talking about enemies within. You have to see it as, this is a democratic project. This is a nation. Democracy does not stop you from being connected to your ethnic group. But when it makes you take action against the very states that you are sworn to protect, there is a problem. Then that is talking about an enemy within. So there are sympathizers, and even sympathizers go even to the general ordinary populace. Why do I say that? Now, we have a situation where many people in these communities don't even know the elected representatives, yet those people are getting monies and other benefits as a result of being representatives. But the people do not know them. However, they know many of these militant and extremist leaders. And some of them also try to masquerade as saviors because of ways of providing socioeconomic basic things to meet people's needs at some certain points in time. Finally, you talked about what role does Sharia promotion in northern Nigeria play? Very interesting question. I want to say that, remember I said 1999 when Nigeria went back to democracy. It is interesting to see that it is after that time we started to have the new democratic leaders in that portion of the country now starting to talk about the importance of imposing Sharia law. Why was that conversation not active during the military regime? Why suddenly, when it was time for democracy for us to begin to rebuild, this became an issue? In my opinion, this is an example, a similar scenario to what you have by the populist government or right-wing governments, let's say in the US and other parts of Europe, where the thing is, you begin to engage in culture wars. The moment you give us the equivalent here in Nigeria or in Africa, where it becomes religion or ethnicity, people begin to focus on that. And then we don't realize that you are not doing the job you were elected for. Democracy does not stop you from practicing your religion, but elected representatives are not elected to be religious crusaders. That's why I keep on going back to talking about enemies within. So if you go there as an elected representative for all people, and then when you are elected, you decide that you only want to be a religious crusader and focusing on that, then people's attention are taken away from your corruption and the fact that you are not doing the very things for which you were elected into office to do. So those are just some of my reflections on those questions. Thank you.
To pick up something that you have said, and I'm going to hand over the baton to Prof. Keith Gottschalk, is that those in power whether democratically elected or through violent means, seem to, across all our countries, whether they be in the US, whether it be in South Africa or in Belgium or in Europe, where we're going to have our next seminar, explore some of that, they will use any means necessary to be able to promote and remain in power while resurrecting ghosts that are not really there, without addressing the central concerns, which are the concerns for the majority of the people. And Keith, there was a question, and I want to ask you to have a look at that in two parts. First is, but do you think that there is sufficient parliamentary oversight that could stymie some of these threats to democracy that you have outlined? And if not, how can we use the institution of democracy to assist in combating these threats? And this is from Dr. Bucas.
To start off with the last question, the limits of parliamentary oversight in South Africa are that all our major political parties have a very strong party culture. And this means that the parliamentary caucus of, for example, the ruling party, the currently ruling party, the ANC, does not have much autonomy against the party headquarters when they lay down the law. So this is a huge inhibition of a parliamentary majority ever asserting parliamentary oversight over corruption or other problems or incompetency and inefficiency at a lower level. This means that there's a correspondingly bigger duty falls on both other institutions of our democracy, for example, the Public Protector's Office, where there's been wildly differing results between different incumbents of it. For example, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, and also upon a huge range of NGOs in civil society. It wouldn't be even possible to memorize off by heart our huge number of NGOs from, let's say, Nadifuno Ukwazi or Abahali Basemonjondolo on the left, standing up for the rights of shack dwellers, through to, let's say, the Institute of Race Relations standing up for property rights on the right wing. But there's a correspondingly bigger duty on all of these, and on the, above all, the investigative journalism. One of the most unexpected big benefits of democracy has been freedom of the press, freedom of opinion, and this has given tremendous, what's the word, benefits for journalism to flourish and to push back by exposing all sorts of horrors. So I think that's my general thought in addressing these two questions.
Thank you very much, Keith. I think you've addressed also the question that Annelies raised about the role that civil society can play. And I think this leads to two important issues. One is just in guarding and coveting the gem that democracy comes, especially when it's through the will of the people, is such an important issue that needs to be held on and foregrounded. And then secondly, that institutions that hold a power to account are really absolutely important. And I think this is something that both Prof. Usang, you, Keith, and Namhla has been talking about. I want to ask you in the following minutes, just your thoughts on what you think would be a cross-cutting issue of solidarity for addressing this domestic extremism on our continent, whether it be in West Africa, whether it be previously like the conflict in Sierra Leone, whether it be the current conflicts in West Africa or on the Horn of Africa. What do you think would be the what are your thoughts on what would be something that can bind those forces that are in service of humanity, in service of international human rights, that look at the needs of the poorest of the poor, who are the subjects of these harsh cruelties between parties. What is it that we can do from your thought on building solidarity across our continent and perhaps internationally to keep these issues foregrounded? I'll start with Prof. Usang.
Thank you very much. I think for me, I think one of the most obvious ones will be education, not in terms of school and all of that, but developmental education that takes into account socioeconomic improvements of the general populace. Because again, if you think about the continent, it's the youngest continent for now. Many people, Prof. Keith was just talking about the number of unemployed people in South Africa. It's the same across the continent. So when you have so many people at the prime of their lives, young people who are not gainfully employed, who don't see any hope for the future, that is a fertile ground for extremism, because those are ready recruits. So measures to advance socioeconomic advancements or promotion of socioeconomic advancement of the general populace. Because when people generally tend to be socioeconomically secure, they are not necessarily predisposed to being used to fight, for lack of a better word, culture wars of this violent extremists and the agenda that they are setting in place. So any program that brings together components of socioeconomic development for the welfare of the general populace, just putting it simplistically.
Thank you. You put it very nicely, Prof. Usang. Thank you very much. Prof. Namhla, your thoughts? Your mic is off.
Yes. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. For me, I think just keeping the dialogue at the continental level, and particularly the leaders. African leaders have to come to the party. They cannot keep supporting each other and turning a blind eye when bad things are happening, and when they are treating their own populations in a despicable manner. So for me, leadership at the continental level is a must. They have to do better. They must do better. And this is something that they haven't done in the past. They've supported each other at all costs, at the expense of their respective populations. So that has to change. So leadership at the continental level, they have to do better.
Thank you. There's an old, the old saying, or the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, was propped up by all the dictators who enjoyed great support during that time, and there was not much. There were not many sanctions that were placed on them internally. So it's a very nice point. Thank you, Prof. Namhla. Keith?
First, I'd like to suggest that the United States practice the school children learn about the Constitution and civics class be introduced in South Africa, and that every year the matric class is taught particularly the Bill of Rights, and then in general terms the rest of the Constitution. The government printed about 10 million copies of the Constitution in plain non-legal language, both in English, isiXhosa, and all the other 9 official languages way back in 1996, but it's never repeated that. And it needs to repeat this every year. Those school children who got this are now 40-year-old adults. The second theme that we can't stress enough, whether it's South Africa, Nigeria, or Ethiopia, is democracy must be seen to deliver. For example, a century before Boko Haram, you had Usman Dan Fodio founding a theocracy in northern Nigeria about 1820 on the slogan that the secular rulers are corrupt. So this theme of opposing corruption is age old and it needs to go on. Now there, when democracy must deliver, the South African democracy has built 3 million houses given with the title deeds as a gift to the unemployed. They own that property. It's not rental public housing. But with our continuing urbanization revolution, we need another 3 million houses, or at least blocks of flats, to be built as speedily as possible. Furthermore, with the terrible unemployment rate of 42%, the social relief of distress grant, that is the first time South Africa has had a dole for the permanently unemployed, this needs to be made permanent. I'm confident that it's got a good chance of it because we're facing municipal elections later this year and no ruling party dare withdraw this grant from 6 million voters months ahead of the election and expect people to vote for it. And last, for democracy to be vibrant, I would urge as many voters as possible to please join the political party of your choice so you have some say in policy making. And of course, some people will prefer to join single issue NGOs like the Campaign Against Nuclear Power Stations, for example. But whatever your choice is, please become involved actively in your democracy. As a resident, join your local ratepayers association and speak up to make government more responsive. Over and out.
Thank you, Keith. And perhaps this is a good space for a final for a comment from my side before I hand over and invite our international directors, Mary Stegmaier, Rod Uphoff, and Annelies Verdulager. And that is that in all your presentation, the common thread is that the people need to be very engaged and active in who they elect to cover that vote. In South Africa in 1994, following our election, we were very euphoric that we had the first time an opportunity to vote. And someone very astutely said that, you know, I voted and I have the right, I have the vote now, but I can't eat the vote. And so those bread and butter issues are really what are required, and all our presenters have raised that very nicely. And then in a way of activism to push back against the tide of tyrants and oppressors. And then I think Frederick Douglass put this really nicely, that the power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And I think perhaps our speakers have raised it very nicely. Could I invite Rod Uphoff and Prof. Mary Stegmaier to say something before we hand over to Annelies? You're muted, Rod.
I'd just like to thank the three presenters. I thought all the presentations were excellent. And the comments afterwards, I think, brought home the points that you were making. Democracy must deliver, or it will allow extremists to make that threat into a reality. And dealing with the underlying socioeconomic conditions, you can't continue to have 42% unemployment and not expect that there will be serious blowback. So if governments don't deal with those issues, then democracy is really under threat.
Thanks very much, Rod. Mary?
Thank you, Umesh. I just wanted to say thank you to you and your colleagues for organizing today's session, the second in our three-part series this spring. So I was pleased to see that there were attendees from South Africa and the University of Missouri system, and also from Ghent University. So thank you for organizing this, and I will turn it over to Annelies.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. All right.
Yes,
yeah,
we can.
thank you. Yeah, thank you, Umesh, and thank you to the organizers at UWC. Yeah, this was a very inspiring session. Since I have a background in African studies, African languages and cultures myself, I found this yeah, really fascinating, very interesting. And I could also see in the chat that some of the presentations well led to some heated debate, and so maybe the discussion will be continued afterwards with some of the presenters, who knows. Yeah, so thank you, that was a terrific webinar. We indeed have the honor from Ghent University to organize the next webinar, which will take place on the 22nd of April, so that's within 2 weeks. We will talk about the European far right and populist parties. So who are they and who are their supporters? So I will have, or we will have 3 presenters from Ghent University, and they will talk about the impact that far right parties can have on democracy. And then in the second part, also focus on radical left and the right-wing supporters. So who are the people actually voting for these radical parties? I welcome you all to participate, obviously. I will put the link to the website in the chats. This will give you more information, and also the registration link is available on this webpage. Okay, I think that is all from my side. So thanks again, Umesh, and thanks to the presenters, and looking forward to welcoming you within 2 weeks for our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annelies, Mary, and Rod. Grant, can I ask Prof. Keith Gottschalk, Prof. Namhla Matshanda, Prof. Usang Assim to please show us their screens, and if you can show us your screen as well, Graham. I'd like to, on behalf of our colleagues, say thank you to Prof. Namhla Matshanda, Prof. Keith Gottschalk, and Prof. Graham Julies and Prof. Usang for this presentation. A recording will be placed on the UWC International Office website, as well as on the University of Missouri, with a link to Ghent University websites that you can look at. So please look at the past recorded sessions, and that if there's any engagement that you'd like, and the chat was on fire, which is wonderful. Please send those emails through to us. The emails will be on the website. In fact, I'll put my email in now, and you can send them to us, and we will then send them to the presenters so you can engage with them. Again, thank you very much, Graham, for organizing this. Colleagues, I look forward to seeing you all on the 22nd, right? 22nd. All
Yes.
right. Thank you very much. Take care, and look, have a good evening. All the strength to you, and please be safe during this difficult time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Umesh. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.